Heavenly Father, thank you for every seat that has been filled here this evening. For each mind and heart that feels the presence of this virtual room, we thank you. Only you truly know what we're setting out to accomplish today. We have an idea, a vision, hints and daily instructions. We have talents, abilities and time to work. However, only you can see in perfect detail the end of every beginning, every project, every season, every life. Nothing ever is in vain, for even mistakes and missteps are used to good. Your righteousness transcends all our efforts and understanding. Forgive us for our pride, the pride that puffs us up and the pride that threatens to unqualify us. Strengthen our confidence in you who have made us to be here. Set us free from comparison in order to work together and efficiently, as well as the lives of those we will encounter afterward. Ready us to make every moment count. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Toby. Jimmy, bless you. It's lovely to have you with us this evening. We're in your hands. I'll be quiet.
Fantastic. Well, it's lovely to be with you. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm a really visual learner. I was just saying to some of the team, I'm a really visual learner. So kind of slides for me are really helpful. And especially in this first session, I'm going to be sharing some statistics. And I know that some people kind of, if you just say numbers, then they're kind of, it kind of goes back over their head. Seeing they're quite helpful. One of the questions that always comes up, I'm going to answer straight off the bat, is how on earth have you done that on Zoom? So just for those of you who are Zoom geeks, it's a new beta function. When you go to press share screen at the top, there's an advanced tab. And one of them is that you can present over the top of your slides. So you get to see my face at the same time as seeing my slides, which, yeah, you can decide whether that's a positive or a negative thing. So we're gonna do this in 2 sessions. Just as a bit of a way of introduction. So my name's Jimmy Dale. Like Martin said, I have the privilege of being the National Youth Evangelism Officer. So I'm based down in London. I live in Woodford, so kind of northeast London, Essex. So I'm Redbridge Deanery. I don't know if there's someone here from Redbridge Deanery, but yeah, and I've been in the role for about 5 years with a remit to promote and resource youth evangelism across the Church of England. So, like I said, we're going to do this in 2 sessions. The first session, we're going to be looking at the kind of the current picture of youth and children's ministry in the Church of England. I think this is it's a really good place to start. I'm a big believer that so often I think we like to sit in a place of kind of anecdote, that whatever the picture is that we kind of want to believe is happening, that's what we're going to believe is happening, and that ends out steering and dictating how we choose to react. So I think knowing where we actually are is such an important thing. But I will warn you that this is potentially a slightly heavy session. You're not going to leave it particularly leaving like leaping and bounding, but I promise it gets more cheerful as we go. So a lot of what I'm going to be referring to is a paper that went to General Synod just before the pandemic, so February 2020, which was research into under 16s Sunday attendance in Anglican churches, or GS2161 as it's known by its friends. So if you want, you can go and you can have a look. There's 40 odd pages of it, lots of stats all broken down. If you're a stats geek, I'm sure you will have an absolute field day with it. But I'm gonna pull out some of the kind of things from that. So there's 2 things that kind of are going to be natural reactions that you're going to hear. You're going to be thinking as this goes. So the first one is this one. So the church needs to do something about this. I think it's so important that within this we see our role within it. That this isn't something which, as a national church, we can look to tackle. Not even at a diocesan level is it something which we can particularly look to tackle. That it needs to be tackled at every single level, right the way through to kind of parishioners in kind of the local churches. The flip end is that we recognise that it's something we need to deal with, but we're very quick to kind of make our excuses. So, well, the reason why we don't have any young people is because of this. Or kind of, oh, well, this church over here, they're the exception, like there's nothing which we can kind of learn from them. What I really want to encourage you throughout this is to view it through a lens of what are the things that we can look to proactively do that are going to see this change. Some of the stuff today is going to be really applicable to you. Some of it's not. That's absolutely fine. But I really want to encourage you to try and lay down some of those kind of immediate kind of reactions that I think sometimes we come up against. So here's kind of a bit of a table that I'm going to kind of talk through. This shows the data over the last kind of, so this actually shows the data over the last 6 years. So the paper was published with the 2018 data. So some of the things that I'll talk about, we'll talk about 2018. That's just where Stats for Mission works a couple of years behind. But what you'll notice, the yellow bar there, that the Church of England is generally in decline. It's kind of 3 or 4% each year, which, I mean, is fairly horrific in itself. But for the purposes of this, it's fine. We'll make do with it. And if you look at the next row across the kind of adults, what you'll see is that for adults, we're kind of roughly in keeping with that. So kind of 3 or 4% each year. And kind of we've declined over that same time period, 14%, 15% overall, but 14% in adults. When you go to the next section over with children, so children is deemed as under 16s, what you find is that actually we're declining at a much sharper rate. So we're declining at 21% over the same time period. Some of those you'll see a really big sizable jump. So 7% decline in 2016, 8% decline in 2018. And actually the decline that we're seeing, it's not that there's an even distribution of young people. That actually what we're finding is that the young people are condensed into a kind of ever shrinking group of churches. So within it, we originally started looking at this data. We were trying to create a database of where there was, just noticing in the questions that kind of we'll make all these slides available. So they're kind of, if you want to go through and dissect them afterwards, that's absolutely fine. But we were originally looking at kind of where there was things happening with young people. And one of the original assumptions was if you went to churches, somebody said, if you look at the Stats for Mission and you find churches that have, say, 50 or more 0 to 16s, that might be a good place to start. But actually what we discovered was that if you look at churches that have 50 or more, there's really not very many of them. We'll come on to a slide about that in a minute. So we shuffle down to the next stage banding down, which is 25 or more. And that's kind of where we'll talk a little bit about 25 or more. That's where that banding has come from. It's not a magical figure. But what you'll see is that the number of churches in the Church of England that have 25 or more 0 to 16s is declining year on year. It's declined by 28% in the number of churches, to the degree that in 2019, there's only 898 churches out of 16,500 parishes who have got 25 or more 0 to 16s. Now, something I want to be really clear on with this is that it's really easy, especially with somebody talking to you with the title of youth, that we think of this as teenagers. And if this was the picture for teenagers, I'd actually be okay about it, but it's not. What we're talking about here is 0 to 16. So we're talking babies, we're talking toddlers, we're talking families. So yes, think teenagers, but think baptisms, think confirmations, think kind of, we're talking right the way through that spectrum. It's a big age banding. Like I said, when you look at this as a distribution, I'm aware at this stage my head's in the way of that one there. There we go, I'll lean across. But what you'll see is that there's a huge swathe of churches. So this is the 2018 data. So 38% of churches don't have any 0 to 16s whatsoever. So that's a huge swathe. Next category up, 1 to 5, there's another 30%. I often joke that means that the vicar's got some kids. If you want an evangelism strategy to move from the blue category to the green category, just see if you can encourage your vicar to have more sex. But there's a huge swathe there where there's churches where, for probably a whole host of reasons, there aren't any 0 to 16s engaging. And at the other end, the kind of assumption that there's this kind of myriad of churches out there, that you'll see there's only 30 churches that have over 100 0 to 16s. That kind of that lower category, that there's really not any at all. When we're looking at this kind of overarching, what we're seeing is that actually the decline that we're seeing is picking up in speed. So the 10-year period from 2003 to 2013, as a whole Church of England, we declined by 25% in the number of 0 to 16s. The following 5 years, 2013 to 2018, we declined by 22%. So nearly the same percentage, but kind of over half the time period. And just that 12-month period, 2017 to 2018, declined by 8%. Now, I'm seeing a number of people in the chat asking about what about that. This is data around average Sunday attendance. Well, there's a whole number of different ways that the Stats Mission team monitor kind of how many people are attending. It really doesn't matter which one you look at. It's the same decline rate in every single one. That the reason why we ended up going with the average Sunday attendance is that the data gets a little bit more sketchy as you move in some of the others, as it's harder to define what's in and what's out. Sometimes people would say, well, we've got this group and it's doing amazing things. But at the same time, so someone's just mentioned about schools. Schools is a fantastic example. So the second biggest church in the Church of England for 0 to 16s, the first is HTB, no real surprise there. But the second is Canterbury Cathedral, who have got a boarding school attached to them for the cathedral. And so on a Sunday, they bring the cathedral school over and they do a service in the church. So kind of there'll be churches where school connections will play a big part in this. Another church that I know in central London, they've got 135 to 11-year-olds trying to get admission into the local school, and then 4 11 to 18-year-olds. So even within the average Sunday, there's a whole bunch of anomalies there, which will kind of shift some of the stats. When you start looking at the average weekly, when you start looking at usual Sunday, when it's kind of worshipping community stats, then actually the data becomes a lot more fuzzy. I'll give you a fantastic example, a story Archbishop Stephen Cottrell was telling me when he was still Bishop in Chelmsford. He had spoken at a Messy church service, and this is a church which normally has about 30 people at it. This particular time, it had 90 parents at it, incredible. And so he spoke, and he said afterwards, "Do you want me to sign the book?" And the vicar said to him, "Oh no, why would you sign the book?" And he said, "Well, I'm a bishop, but I know what's going on here. I just did a service. It'd be good to sign the book." And the vicar said, "Oh no, it is wonderful though. One of the mums has started coming on a Sunday." And so I think that Messy Church is a fantastic example. But I think that there's a whole bunch of different ways. I haven't got the slides with me, but if you want to email me, that if you were to say include Messy churches, there's I think 1,400 kind of registered Messy churches. The number of young people who we have, that could be, I think it's about 40% of all the young people, assuming a kind of average attendance of about 25 0 to 16s at a Messy church service. If you looked at this around confirmation, if you looked at this around infant baptism, so kind of christenings, the number of christenings that we had in 2018, if we managed to maintain that connection with that, so that's a family coming and saying, look, we've got a child, we want to raise them as a Christian, can we kind of do something to signify that? If we could hold that connection for just 1 year, that would make over 90% of the young people who we have on a Sunday. So I think that there's huge areas in this that potentially aren't being picked up, but I think there's also huge areas where we're missing enormous missional opportunities. So like I said, there's this kind of this group of churches. So 6.4% of our churches have got 44% of under 16s for the whole of the Church of England. And I think one of the things that I'm really keen within this is that I think there's become a narrative that there are big churches and the big churches have all the young people. And that leads to one of two things. It either leads to a kind of resentment of the big church that has all the young people, or it leads to a kind of resignation that there's no point in us doing anything because the big church has all the young people. But the thing which is really interesting within all the stats is that it really doesn't matter where you are, that the decline is pretty much universal. So if you look at that top bar, so churches that have 25 or more, over half of them are in decline. It's slightly better when you look at all churches until you realize that the 25% who are stable, that's because they've gone from 0 to 0, most of them. So actually the number of churches who are growing, and especially who are growing consistently, is a very small figure. One of the things which I found really interesting is that lots of churches, which we assume are the big church and they have all the young people, when you look at the data, what you found was that 10 years ago, they were the big church. And actually, systematically, that number has just declined. But there's still this kind of narrative of either fear or resignation that we either need to avoid them or just give in. And actually, I think that what these numbers paint a picture of is it paints a picture that we need to collectively say, how do we begin to engage with this in a much better way? I want to give you 3 things that I want you to take away from these figures, and then we're going to go to a bit of a Q&A time. So the first thing is that everyone is struggling to grow, that there's not some super churches out there which are flying off the handle, that whether you're a big church or a small church, that the growth is kind of limited at best, and that for most there's an element of decline to what's happening. The second thing is about being realistic about where you are and stopping comparing yourself to others. I think within the Church of England, especially when it comes to figures, that the comparison game is absolutely killing us. That kind of, what are my numbers bigger than your numbers? Why are your numbers so big? That actually, I think that there's a kind of, almost we need a kind of an honesty amnesty that, you know what, universally as a whole church, we're struggling around this area around how do we engage 0 to 16s, and how do we begin to look at how we do this. And in the second section, I'm going to give you some tips and ideas about how we can begin to start doing that, especially within a deanery structure. And the third thing is about asking yourself what you're willing to do to see growth happen. I've got a bit of an analogy that I use for this, because I think this is, for me, this is really, really helpful. I think in my mind, the Church of England breaks down into 3 parts. There's those who are doing something with children and young people. That's where we're going to set the bar. We're not talking employing a youth worker. We're talking doing something. And I think, kind of looking at the statistics, you're probably looking at about, 15% of churches who are doing something with 0 to 16s. You may well be in a church which is in that category, and that's fantastic. I think at the other end, you've got a whole bunch of other churches, probably 35, 40%, who don't have young people. And if they're really honest, they don't want young people. I've had vicars tell me, look, Jimmy, I'll be honest with you, I've got 30 old ladies, they pay the parish share. Why on earth would I risk changing things for some hypothetical teenagers? And I think that within that again, there's kind of, that is what it is. But I think there's this big middle category, which we call the maybe churches. And I'm quite sure in all of your deaneries, you will know what I'm talking about when it comes to maybe churches. When you say, could you do something with children and young people? And they go, oh yeah, no, maybe. Yeah, that sounds good. I think we would like to do that. And the analogy which I use, which partially gives me an opportunity to boast, it's a couple of years ago, I did an Ironman race. It's a bit on my bucket list for years. If you haven't come across an Ironman race, an Ironman is an extreme triathlon. So you swim 2.4 miles in the sea, you cycle 112 miles over the Welsh mountains. I did mine in Wales. And then you run a marathon, so 26 miles at the end. So I did it in just over 15 hours. But there is an enormous amount of training that goes into it. So I was training for about a year. It's about 30 hours of training a week I was doing. So you're up at 4 a.m. to do cycle rides in the rain, and then go to work and come straight out of work, and you go into a swim session or a track session. And every weekend is given over to long rides and long runs. There's a joke in the Ironman world that if you get to the start line and you're still married, you didn't train hard enough. And it's not really too much of a joke. Like, there's a horrifically high divorce rate, but it's this assumption that if you want to do Ironman, and this isn't to complete it, if you just want to get to the start line, this is what's required of you. But I did that because I wanted to do Ironman. It's on the bucket list. It's something I want to do. Now, I also say I want to learn how to speak French. Genuinely, wholeheartedly believe I want to learn how to speak French. I am not committing 30 seconds a week to learning how to speak French, let alone 30 hours. If I committed 30 hours a week to learning how to speak French, I could speak French. And we're not talking years, we're talking months, maybe even weeks, and I'm fluent in French. So I can break it down and I can analyze it, and I can go, well, clearly in that case, I don't want to learn how to speak French. But something deep within me goes, no, I do want to learn how to speak French. It's genuinely a desire that I have. And the conclusion that I've come to is that actually what I want to have the ability to speak French. As long as I don't have to do anything, it doesn't cost me anything, I don't have to change anything. If I can click my fingers and suddenly I'm fluent in French, that is on my bucket list. That is what I want to do. And I think the problem is that I'm going to continue to communicate that as, oh, I'd love to learn how to speak French. It's a real passion of mine. And I think we've got a whole bunch of churches who say with all sincerity, with a genuine belief that they are telling you the truth, that, oh, we'd love to have young people in our church. It's a real passion of ours. It's on our mission statement. It's one of our real priorities in the church. We really want to see it. And my challenge is, and is it Ironman or is it French? Is it something where we're willing to say, whatever the cost, whatever it is that we need to do, I'll do it because I want to see children and young people come to my church? Or actually, are we saying, you know what, if a bunch of young people want to file into my church without me having to do anything, without me having to change anything, or without me having to costing me anything, if they just want to file in, sit down, sit quietly and file out at the end, that's what I actually want. Is that what we're saying? So I suppose that's my challenge to you off the back of this, is that all of those stats are super depressing. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes I feel a little bit like Jeremiah, but I suppose my challenge to us is how do we begin to stir the church that it sees children and young people as something which we're willing to say, I will do anything to see children and young people come into the church and encounter Jesus Christ, who we all know transforms lives. There we go. Just as people are coming back and my slides are loading up, I'm just saying for those who weren't back, I've popped a link in the chat for people who wanted to go and examine the synod paper, and then you can you can do that to your heart's content. The link's there. I'm just gonna skip through to the session 2. Here we go. So session 2, we're going to look a little bit more practically how to grow youth and children's ministry in your deanery is what I've optimistically called this. Within this is I've tried to kind of gear it around 5 things. I suppose they're principles more than anything else, but things that would hopefully help the churches in your deanery to begin to think about how do they begin to engage with this. So just as you kind of got a little bit of a picture of where we're going, these are the 5. So set a culture, map what you have, utilize your churches with growth, ensure faith is central to what you're doing, and have clear expectations. Like I said, all these slides will be available at the end. If you think of questions as we're going, pop them in the chat. Hopefully lots of what we talk about in this will kind of help flesh out some of the stuff that was coming out in the questions from the last session. So first one, set a culture. I think this is so key, setting a culture. I think that there's a whole bunch of things that we can be doing when it comes to children and young people, which we just totally overlook. So, I mean, I've suggested 4 here, which I think you can do this at a deanery level. You can encourage this at a church level. So when you're thinking about your deanery synod, how often are these 4 things there? So the first thing, praying for young people. I remember somebody once saying that if you've got a church which is saying we don't have any young people and we haven't got anyone who can volunteer to do it and we don't know where to start, then say, okay, well, every single week we're going to have a prayer meeting and we're going to pray for nothing but young people for an hour. And you know what? Come back in 6 months' time and you've got a group of people who've been praying for 6 months for young people. I guarantee a few of them feel a bit more passionately and might probably want to volunteer or have some ideas about where they might want to start. I think starting with prayer is such a key thing. Like we talk about it all the time, but actually so often praying for children and young people is kind of a token sentence which we'll chuck in. How do we make time to intentionally pray for the children and young people in our deanery and in our parishes? So second thing is regularly discussed. Again, I remember somebody once saying to me, if we discuss children and young people as much as we discuss finance in the Church of England, we'd be in a very different place. Like, is children and young people a regular part of what we're talking about? And I'm sure you'll get a whole bunch of kickback of like, why are we talking about this? Nothing has changed. Like, there's nothing great, like nothing's changed. Well, we should probably do something about that. But actually, if we're regularly discussing it, then it's regularly being pushed to the top again. And it's constantly where people are thinking, actually, how can we begin to address this? Third thing, it sounds really like obvious, include young people. So there was a report which came out about 5 years ago now called Rooted in the Church. If you Google it, you'll find it, which looked at kind of 4 things. They interviewed people in their 20s who'd stayed in church and what were some of the key things that had helped us keep them there. one of the 4 things that they found was being included in the church. So whether that looked like serving or helping to contribute on a Sunday or being on a rota or whatever else, like young people want to be included. So again, I mean, I'm going to use deanery synods as a good example. Like deanery synods, how many young people are on your deanery synod? Like what's the youngest age of somebody in your deanery synod? And I'm aware that kind of you've got churches who have to like nominate people, but actually could you say that, you know what, we're going to say that we want at least 4 people on our deanery synod. I don't know how big your deanery synods are. It will vary, I'm sure. But like set a number. We want at least this quota of them to be under the age of 18. That actually they can go on from 16, and actually you can have them there as observers from younger. And actually, not just have them there as kind of quiet people in the corner. And like, if we're going to regularly discuss them, bring them to the front and go, you know what, we've been talking about X, Y, and Z in our deanery for the last kind of hour. What are your thoughts? What do you think about that? They are going to give you a whole bunch of stuff that you would not have thought of. But unless you give them that opportunity, it's never going to happen. I think that within that, we've got to be willing to take some risks. I remember a youth worker once telling me that so often we're tokenistic in how we do this. He was talking about having young people on the PCC. He's like, if you really want to think about how willing we are to let young people be involved, let the young people in the church choose how much I'm paid as a salary. And you just watch the whole room just wince at this idea. But there's like, how do we move it beyond just kind of tokenistic, like we've ticked a box, that's good, to actually seeing young people included in the decisions that we're making. And then the 4th thing is invest in volunteers. The reason why I put this on there is I think, again, there is this narrative that youth ministry in particular, but children's ministry as well, that it's for the special select few that kind of employed youth and children's workers. And if you are in a church which is fortunate enough to have enough finance to have a children and youth worker, then great. For a start, the number of children and young people, youth workers in the Church of England is nowhere near where we think it is. So there's about 1,800 across the whole Church of England, and that's in fairly kind of rapid decline. But actually, the churches that have employed youth and children's workers, so this is, again, based on the Sunday statistics, there are 24 youth and children's workers who are employed in churches that don't have a single 0 to 16 showing up on a Sunday. In fact, 9% of youth workers are employed in churches that have 5 or less on a Sunday. And we've got 1 in 5. So you're talking 19% of churches who employ a children's or a youth worker to have less than 10 on a Sunday. And again, this is 0 to 16s I'm talking about here. So if you have a narrative, which is the thing that is standing in our way is if we could employ a youth and children's worker, that would turn the tide. That would be the difference. The statistics say, no, that's not what's going to change the tide. And even if you manage to find a way to get the very best youth worker in the whole country to come and work at your church, that would still not do anything unless you had a team of volunteers behind. So when it comes to it, and we're talking about how do we invest in volunteers, that again, this kind of narrative of, well, we probably need to look at employing a youth worker. And I speak to lots of deaneries who will say things like, we're going to try and employ a youth worker across all the deaneries. Actually, would a better strategy be to say, what would happen if we asked all the churches to contribute 1 volunteer? And actually, is there a way that we can invest in those volunteers and then do something together? Because actually having a bedrock of volunteers is going to do you so much more good as far as how you grow youth and children's ministry than outsourcing it to a youth worker. Because so often what ends up happening is we end out with, I call it middle class syndrome. I don't like doing gardening, but I like having a garden. So we pay a gardener to come into our garden once every 6 weeks and do all the weeding and stuff that I don't want to do. Now, I pay them to do it. I'm not going to go out in the meantime and do a bit of weeding. Like I'm paying someone so I don't have to think about it. And I think so often that's how we end up viewing youth and children's ministry, that kind of, if we could just pay somebody to do it so I don't have to think about it. And actually everything that we were talking about before, about families, about it being central to the church, that's got to be key. And I think volunteers is the way forward with that. So that's our first one. So setting a culture. The next one up is map what you have. So mapping what you have. This is a little diagram that kind of I've been kind of using a lot recently. especially kind of as we're emerging out of the pandemic and kind of people are starting to look again at kind of, well, where are we now kind of with our youth and children's ministry. I think for most churches, this is kind of the breakdown of what their youth and children's ministry looks like. So there's a core group. And within this one, I'm probably talking about the kind of 15% who have got something going on, whatever that is. There's a core group that might only be one or two, but there's a core group who it doesn't matter what you're doing, basket weaving, cross stitch, bowls with the elderly, like they're there. Like they are committed to coming. They're normally the ones who are most on fire in their faith. And they're the ones which kind of we tend to focus around. Then you kind of have this fringe group. So kind of a group who they'll drop in, they'll come to stuff. The classic is when we do a social, suddenly the number of children and young people we have doubles. So we've got another group that sit around that. And then we've got this other group, which I call the disengaged, which the classic is it's the curate's kids who have told their dad in no uncertain terms that they don't want to come to anything to do with the church. And there's this sense that actually what we really are about is we're about retention evangelism. That's what I've taken to calling it. It's about how do we hold on to what we have. So that core are great. It'd be great if we could suck a few more of the fringe in. And if we're really honest, actually, we should be doing something for the disengaged. And so that becomes the kind of the focus of what we have. I think there's a whole other flip side to that, which is that we haven't got many kind of in that church bracket. And I'm kind of using these terms really broadly. You have to forgive me, but they're kind of the flip side to that. I'm kind of calling the community group. And so within the community group, there's young people's friends. So that might be the core group, it might be the fringe group, but again, kind of we're going to do a special social. So we're going to go laser tagging or whatever it is. And suddenly they might invite a few friends. And so you suddenly become aware that there's this whole extra arena of young people who you have kind of second-hand contact with. That's great. But then there's an even bigger group. So if you haven't, I'll pop a link to it in the chat. There's an amazing resource that the stats team have put out, which it's called the ArcGIS mapping service, which enables you to go in. You can look at it for your deanery, you can look at it for parishes. There's all kinds of different layers. But essentially, it enables you to map your the kind of boundaries around whichever area it is that you're looking at, and the data from the census. So you can see how many young people are in your parish or how many young people are in your deanery. And sometimes that can be hugely depressing because you can realize that even in the places where you think you're doing quite well, it's such a minute percentage of the young people who are in the area. And that can lead really sensibly to saying, well, there's a whole kind of, I mean, Jesus talks about like the fields of right. There's all these young people out there. How do we go and reach them? And so we talked a bit about sports ministry. That's a fantastic way of doing that. How do we reach young people in the community? It might be detached work. It might be whatever else. But then we see the kind of the holy grail, which is young people in local schools, because I can commit an hour's time, and what I suddenly find is that I can get in front of 500 young people, and that is brilliant. 500 young people is the real win. I'm going to come back to this one a little bit later, this picture, because I think mapping what we have is a really good place to start, because I think so often we don't realize what we have. It might be that even as I've been saying that thinking of your own churches, that you'll be sat there saying, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about them as a group who we could look to engage with. And so even just literally sitting down and writing down the names, so that group of volunteers who have kind of tentatively kind of agreed to form a group and talk about youth and children's work, like actually just writing down the names of the young people who are in that core section, who are in that fringe section, who might be the young people's friends who've come along to something, young people you know in the community. And you might want to do this with children, you can do this with families. But I think that mapping process is so key. I think what is interesting is that so often we end up focusing on the community stuff. And the reason why we focus on the community stuff is, as I've tried to illustrate with the little pictures, numbers is what we're really about. That we have a narrative that numbers equal success. So therefore, the bigger the number that I can say I've engaged with, the more successful I am. But actually, I think so often, especially that core group, that it's at the neglect of that core group. I'm constantly struck by the fact that when you look at Jesus and Jesus' ministry, Jesus had 5,000 followers. Of the 5,000, he had 72. Of the 72, he had 12 12 he had 3, 3 he had 1. The time and investment that he puts into, especially the 3, like it's embarrassingly disproportionate. There's whole chapters of the Gospels where you think, great, the disciples are there and the camera pans out and you realize that the other 9 have been left on the other side of a lake 3 chapters previously. And I think that there's something really telling about that if you look at that within our modern setting, you'd say, Jesus, you've got 5,000 followers. You need to make sure that we're engaging with the 5,000. But actually, Jesus invests in those 3. And when he dies and rises and ascends, the other 9, we only really know what happens to them through other historical texts. It's the 3 who he's invested in, who are the ones who roll out the global church. So actually within this, part of my challenge about this is how do we invest really deeply, even if we've only got a few, that instead of saying, well, there's no point, we've only got a few, how do we invest really deeply with those where we've only got a few? There was a piece of research we've done talking to Jesus, which was done a couple of years ago, which asked what the 2 or 3 most important reasons were that people thought in bringing them to faith. So this was 11 to 18-year-olds who were asked this. 41%, the biggest group by an absolute landslide, was growing up in a Christian family. It was the biggest impact on them coming to faith. Second biggest, 21%, reading the Bible. Third was Sunday school. Fourth was going to a religious school. And number 5 was going to a regular church service. So not a wedding, a funeral, baptism. And it's key to note that that's different from 13%, which is visiting a church building, 13% in a youth group, 10% going to a wedding, funeral, baptism, 11% going to a youth service. That is just going to your regular bog standard service. Now that top row, I am going to take a stab in the dark here that there is not a church in any of your deaneries that cannot do those 5 things. They all seem so old hat, but what we have in this piece of research is young people saying these are the most effective ways about seeing me become a Christian. And I think that so often we overlook them because we flip the other way. I will just pick up the 13% visiting a church building. So many vicars I speak to, the children from St. Peter's Primary School coming down for their year 6 visit. Oh, all right, let's get this over. Like there's other statistics which basically say that 45% of children and young people don't know anybody who's an active Christian. Nobody, not their nan, not their next door neighbor, not the lollipop lady, nobody. Which means that when that group of 30 kids shows up at your church, you are the first Christian that they have ever come into contact with. And for 13% of young people, they say that is one of the 2 or 3 biggest reasons that they come to faith. Like that's a huge evangelistic opportunity. So I was saying that this is kind of the first page. This second page, the thing which I find really interesting within this is the stuff that so often we assume we need to do, the cool stuff, the things that young people want. So holiday clubs and camps and schools, missions and courses and stuff online and new forms of church. I always like to point out that you're as likely to say that these have been the 2 or 3 biggest reasons for you coming to faith as you are to say a dream or vision is the thing. So don't get me wrong, I love those things. I think that they are brilliant, but not at the neglect of these things. That if we've only got a few and actually we can do these things, how do we do these things really well? So that's kind of map what we have. The third thing I want to talk about is utilizing your churches with growth. I'd really encourage you to do this. I've become a little bit of a geek now with stats mission data. I think it's really telling. It's a fantastic way to start conversations with vicars. They tend to get very defensive to start with, and then when they realize that you've seen their numbers, suddenly they open up quite a lot. But what you'll find is that there probably is 1 or 2 churches in your deanery who have some young people. They've got something going on, and that is great. The problem is that all the other churches in the deanery probably view them as one big threat who are just one step away from stealing all their children and young people who they may or may not hypothetically have. I think that they're our biggest asset. I want to tell you about in Oxford Diocese, there's something which the diocese has started doing in partnership with a church called St. Leonard's Church in Ensham. So St. Leonard's Church is a kind of fairly big church in a kind of market town, but their youth ministry is all geared through a sort of small group, cell group model. And they were doing it, and what they realized was that they they had probably out there about 70 young people coming along, and about 30 of those belonged to the church. They kind of came in one capacity or another, but all the rest of them came to other local churches. So Ollie, who's the youth worker there, what he started doing was going to other churches locally and saying, look, you've got 3 or 4 young people. How about you create a small group, a kind of a cell group for these guys? Every week we write the material, we'll send that to you. That's absolutely fine. Every month we do a social, we do a worship event together. That's great. In the summer we go away on a camp together. You can come on that. All the way through you're being resourced, but all the way through it's your young people, your leader, your church. So you hold the identity while being resourced. The thing which is really interesting is that Ollie said that a whole bunch of the church leaders came back to me and went, nah, can you just do it for me? And that's where that French versus Iron Man attitude comes out. But I would imagine that there's at least a couple of churches who actually, that could be the catalyst that sees them say, you know what, I've got a few young people and I've got one person who isn't too confident, but they're willing to be a leader within this capacity. Actually, could that church, which has some young people, could they become, whether you want to, whatever terminology you want to use for it, but could that become a resource to help them get something established? The flip side to that is, so this is a model from something called Search to Belong by Joseph Myers, which I think is really interesting. He talks about the different spaces that exist within youth ministry. It's equally true within churches, but kind of as an all-age thing. But the thing which is really interesting is that so often when we talk about children's and youth ministry, it all focuses around that kind of that social space. And the social space talks about being about availability. That's what we're shooting for. And what we really want is we want to get them to that. And then the aim is to work them up to the public space, to the celebration event. And that might be a Sunday morning service. That might be a camp in the summer, but there's a big pinnacle moment. And if we can get them to that, that will be the catalyst moment. The thing which I think so many churches have experienced during, especially the last 18 months, has been the power in moving down the circles, and how so often we neglect moving down these circles. That personal space, the kind of that small group type thing, that actually the amount of churches which had to move to a kind of small group model where they would have had kind of bigger groups to start with. And what they found was that core group of young people who they were sure were the ones who, like, oh, well, they're the vicar's kids. Of course, they're kind of following Jesus. And suddenly they realized that there was nothing there. They were having to do kind of really basic kind of catechesis with them around kind of what is faith. But actually almost stepping it down below that. So kind of the 2 to 4 space, so they call it the intimate space. So that might look kind of one of the terms which started to be used as pods, but kind of small groups is probably the easiest way to understand it. It might look like mentoring. It's a fantastic resource that's come out of Ireland called Walk With Me, which is an app that helps anybody to do mentoring with young people. But then finally that one space, the divine space, again, kind of, it's been simultaneously so exciting, but also so depressing, talking to young people and realizing quite how much we've neglected that. What does it look like for you to have that kind of personal disciplines of walking with Jesus? To be reading your Bible, to be praying, to be sharing your faith, whatever that looks like. The youth at my church, I help volunteer. I've talked more to them about personal disciplines over the last kind of 18 months than I think I have in the 15 years of doing youth ministry. I think within this, don't neglect the small stuff because we want the big visible stuff. That actually, I think there's ways we can do the smaller stuff, and I think we can do that supported by each other within that. I'm aware of, so I'm going to kind of crack on to number 4. So number 4, ensure faith is central to what you're doing. We've kind of touched very briefly on this with the sports stuff. I'm a bit of a Simon Sinek fanboy. If you haven't read his book, Start With Why, read it. If you haven't got time to read it, watch the TED Talk. It's about 10 minutes long, but it will transform your thinking on this. He talks about these kind of 3 circles. So he talks about the fact that everybody knows what we do. Some people know how we do it. Very few know why we do it. And he says that the difference between good companies and great companies is that great companies start with why. They tell you the reason why they do what they do. Then they tell you how they do it, and then they tell you what they do. And I think so often we tell people what we do, and what we do is we need to do something with children and young people. We never really get to why we're doing it. But I think it's such a key question. And that kind of numbers equals success becomes the driver of why we want it. We want to see lots of young people because that will make us feel good about how we're doing as a church. I mentioned I was going to quote from this book, The End of Youth Ministry. So Simon Sinek, try again. Andrew Root talks about the fact that our kind of USP is that they're looking for, like young people are looking for the good, and that we've moved from a parenting structure that used to be about helicopter parenting, and it's now about bulldozer parenting. So it's about a parent saying, what is going to give my child the greatest good in their life, the biggest perceived good? So if they've got a choice between coming to church on a Sunday morning or going to play football, actually, you know what? They're really good at football and they're being scouted at the moment, and they might get to play for the local team. And then they can go on and become a professional footballer. And actually, that would set them up for life. So actually, the perceived good is greater in football than it is in church. And so what we end up doing is we end up compensating. And we forget the fact that ultimately the good that we offer isn't our own personal good, but it's the good that is experienced in Jesus. So Andrew Root says there's youth ministries for the good. For youth ministry to be about God, it must be about seeking and following the good. Youth ministry's aim, its why, is not just a good life. Every basketball camp, debate club, and computer club claims to deliver this. This kind of good life offers happiness, identity, and good life. It seeks to give young people visions and practices in which the point of life is to encounter and participate in the good. It aims for the good as an end, and it seeks an encounter with God as the source of the good. I really recommend reading that book. It's genuinely one of the best books I think I've ever read. But this idea that our USP is that ultimately we have a relationship with God, and we have the ability to introduce people to this God which transforms lives. I've always been struck. I remember somebody years ago telling me about a quote from Penn, so Penn and Teller. So Penn's an atheist, but he said this: I've always said that I don't respect people who don't proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe that there's a heaven and a hell and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life, and you think that it's not really worth telling them because it would make it socially awkward. And as for atheists who think people shouldn't proselytize and who say, just leave me alone and keep your religion to yourself, how much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? I mean, if I believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that a truck was coming at you and you didn't believe that truck was bearing down on you, there's a certain point where I'd tackle you. And this is more important than that. For me, that's one of those quotes that just gives me sleepless nights, that I think so often we've got caught in that idea of how can we be more fun? How can we be more glitzy? And we do that at the compromise of the why. How do we make sure that the reason why we do what we do is because we love Jesus and we want to see those young people encounter him too? Moving on to our final one. So number 5, have clear expectations. So I said we were going to kind of come back to this earlier. This idea about what we really want is we want to see young people in the core. That's kind of where we want. And so our logic is if we go to the schools, that's where we're going to see the biggest number of young people. And the hope is that we will see some of those young people transition to the core. That's the trajectory that we're hoping for with this. However, so often we don't see that materialize. And Archbishop Stephen Cottrell wrote a book a couple of years ago, like over a decade ago now, which again, I would really, really recommend going and getting a copy of. So From the Abundance of the Heart, Catholic Evangelism for All Christians. It's in this book, he basically talks about he's gearing it at the church. He always says he got fed up of talking to Anglo-Catholics who told him that they didn't do evangelism. So he wrote a book to say, this is why you should do evangelism. And he uses this model where he says, what we want to see in this model is we want to see commitment. And so our logic is that the more contact we make, the more commitment we will see. And if we're not seeing commitment, then actually what we need to do is we need to make more contact. And you see this in our churches, that we'll spend endless amounts of energy doing more and more contact stuff in the hope that it will translate into people making commitments and coming on a Sunday. And actually, he makes the point that basically, unless you're Paul, very rarely does this happen. That normally there's a middle section that happens, which he calls nurture. So nurture is where we ask the questions, we're able to dig deeper, we're able to explore what does this look like? And I think so often within that, the problem that we have is we have a kind of one-size-fits-all model. Within the nurture stuff, something which I found just incredibly helpful. So there's an organization called Fusion who do stuff with university students, but they've created something called Mission Styles. So missionstyles.org, you can go on, you can check that out. And they've identified from the ministry of Jesus 4 ways that people can do this nurture stuff. So one of them is kind of convince me. So convince me, they talk about John 20, kind of convince me, Thomas. This tends to be the go-to of evangelicals. It's kind of your standard kind of apologetics type evening. You've got questions, I've got answers, let's thrash this out. That's only one of the 4. At the other end, you've got let me experience. So let me experience just wants to try stuff. So Luke 10, the sending of the 72. And at the other end of the spectrum, Anglo-Catholics tend to do this one really well, kind of incredibly experiential. But I think so often with the experiential stuff, we kind of have this caveat of the young people aren't ready yet. What happens if we just chuck them in? What happens if, like, some of them will hate it, some of them will love it, some of them that will be exactly the way which they want to do it. Talk with me is the third one. So talk with me, they talk about the Emmaus Road in Luke 24. So Jesus walks alongside them and he says, what are you talking about? Now he knows what they're talking about, but essentially he's saying, what is going on in your lives? And how do I help you find where is Jesus at work in that? So that might look like mentoring. It might look like getting in alongside one-to-one type stuff. And then finally, show me. So show me person. So talk about John 8, feeding the 5,000, kind of practically feeding them. So that might be food banks or homeless shelters or whatever else. But you following Jesus makes a difference. Show me the difference that it makes. Now, I don't know if you've come across the Love Languages book. The easiest way to think about this is that you will have a love language version of Mission Styles. You'll have one of those which will be your default way of deciding to do the nurture stuff with people, let alone young people. And the problem is that there is an assumption that that is the same way that the young people want to experience mission. So part of my challenge within this is how do we find a way where actually we're trying a whole bunch of different ways of doing nurture. I'm going to come back to this. So coming out of nurture, again, Stephen Cottrell talks about the fact that very rarely do people make an unprompted decision to make a commitment. Whatever that looks like, whether that's confirmation classes, whether that looks like offering the opportunity to pray with somebody, whether that looks like standing up at a youth festival, how do we build in a rhythm that sees in a whole variety of different ways the ability for young people to make a commitment to follow Jesus? And then within that, so Kendra Casey Dean, who's an American youth theologian, she talks about barcode theology, that we just need to get the barcode on them, scan them into heaven, jobs are good, and you go sit in the waiting room, we're going to go out and make some more contact. That's really detrimental. That actually there's this whole section afterwards, which Stephen Cottrell calls growth. I always paraphrase it as, now I've said yes to Jesus, what have I actually said yes to? And the statistics show that we see loads of young people come in pre-11, they might make that commitment, but actually no one ever does that growth stuff with them. And so they disappear. And especially the kind of 11 to 14 age category, we see a huge drop off there. But part of that growth thing is not only saying, what does faith look like for me personally, but it's realizing that actually you are called to go out and make contact. So actually this becomes a circular model. Stephen Cottrell makes the point that all 4 of those are evangelism, but they are only evangelism on 2 conditions. The first condition is that all 4 are present. And the second is that they work in conjunction with each other. So coming back to this and this idea of having clear expectations, I'm sure that for all of us, our prayer is that we would love to see the cause in our churches grow exponentially. But that's not going to happen unless you have a really clear expectation on how it's going to happen. And for me, that model from Stephen Cottrell was really helpful in thinking some of that through. So if you're going to go out and you're going to do schools ministry or sports ministry or whatever else, that's fantastic contact stuff. Where's the nurture space that's going to move to? And actually, it's not going to be that all the young people are going to move to the nurture space all simultaneously. It's not even that they're all going to move to the same nurture space. You might have to do a whole host of different nurture spaces. But you know what? We've got a whole church who we need to engage in seeing this as a priority. So finding ways where we can do this. Like so many young people I know who will talk about elderly ladies in churches who gave them time, who sat down next to them and asked them genuinely how their day was. Like that, so many who will say that was a pivotal point looking back, that actually that can be a fantastic nurture space. How are we finding ways to utilize that? So I'm aware that we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna finish up there. So we've got a bit of time for some questions.